Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. We're going to take a couple seconds to wait for everyone to join, so sit tight and we'll get started in a moment. All right, let's take it away. Thank you all for joining us today for this panel on ICIJ's latest investigation, Cancer Calculus. For those of you who might not know us, we're the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We're a global nonprofit that leads large cross-border investigations. We partner with hundreds of reporters around the world to expose the broken systems that are deepening inequality. The Cancer Calculus, our most recent investigation, explores the cost of the life-saving anti-cancer drug Keytruda. Working with 47 media partners over the course of a year, our reporting showed how a set of pharmaceutical industry practices have kept the price of the medication high and treatments out of reach. For cancer patients all over the world, the consequences can be life or death. I'm Carmen Molina Acosta. I'm ICIJ's digital producer, and I'll be leading today's conversation. Joining me today is our Pulitzer Prize winning chief reporter, Sydney Freedberg. Hi, Sydney.
Hey.
Sydney spearheaded our collaboration and reporting on this project, turning herself into an expert on all things Keytruda, big pharma, and drug pricing. We're also joined by Bill Pajerowski from Serif Health, a San Francisco data analytics company that focuses on pricing and transparency. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Carmen. Hi, Sydney.
Okay.
Happy to be here.
During our reporting, Serif shared data with us that helped reveal the cost of Keytruda can vary really dramatically, depending on where the drug is given, which insurance companies and providers are involved, and even how it's billed. So before we start, I did want to let you all know that this conversation is being live streamed and recorded, and there will also be an opportunity to submit questions for Q&A at the end. We might not get to everything, but we'll do our best to cover our bases. So with that, let's take it away. I'm going to get this conversation started with Sydney. Sydney, can you explain to our audience what is Keytruda and why does this one drug matter so much right now?
Okay, well, Keytruda is a cancer drug. It's made by Merck. Um, its chemical name is pembrolizumab, or Pembro for short. It's an infusible immunotherapy drug, meaning it's a type of cancer treatment that uses a person's own immune system to attack cancer cells. And what makes it so special is that it works across many different types of cancers, not just one. It's approved for conditions including lung cancer, melanoma, which is the most serious form of skin cancer, kidney cancer, triple negative breast cancer, and several other kinds of cancers. And in some patients, it's produced long-lasting remissions that older types of chemotherapy couldn't achieve. But it doesn't work for many, indeed most cancer patients. So why does it matter so much? I think there are three reasons. For starters, it's the best-selling drug in the world and possibly of all time. It might become the best-selling drug of all time. Last year, it generated $30 billion in revenue. That's about half of Merck's revenue. So that creates an enormous dependency on one product. And that brings me to the second reason why it matters, because Keytruda's patent protection is nearing expiration. So Wall Street, Merck competitors, doctors, policymakers, they're all watching to see what happens with this drug when the patents begin expiring in 2028. So when a blockbuster drug like Keytruda loses exclusivity, other companies can launch lower cost versions. Historically, that can cause massive revenue declines, what analysts call a patent cliff. For Keytruda, it may be one of the biggest patent cliffs of all times. We found that Merck has applied for more than 1,200 patents worldwide, which could delay generic competitors and successfully keep Keytruda prices astronomically high. And that brings us to the third reason why Keytruda matters, because Keytruda is having a huge impact on healthcare systems around the world. Annual costs for this drug can exceed $200,000 a year, and that's forcing public health systems and patients worldwide into financial and legal battles for access that are not sustainable. And I'm sure we're going to get into that in a little bit.
We absolutely will. Um, Sydney, one thing that you mentioned in your stories for this project is you describe Keytruda as, quote, a case study of a broken system, unquote. Can you elaborate a little bit on what makes it such a clear example of a broader systematic issue?
Yeah, I think there are, a bunch of things. The first, it's a little complicated, but it's because of how drug markets reward blockbuster monopoly economics beyond the original scientific breakthrough. With Keytruda, what we see is essentially one breakthrough has become dozens of monopolies, and some Keytruda treatments work far better than other treatments. So Keytruda was initially approved for advanced melanoma in 2014. And after that, Merck kept running clinical trials in more cancers and treatment combinations. So more and more patients benefited. But the patent system also lets companies continually extend their exclusivity by obtaining new patents on additional cancer types, dosing schedules, combination. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Combination therapies, additional cancer types, and foundations such as formulations such as subcutaneous shots that Merck is now promoting. And this practice is often called evergreening or patent thickening. Instead of one finite monopoly period tied to the original invention, a drug can accumulate a wall of patents that makes competition extremely difficult. So that's one way. It's a classic for a broken system. Another way is that public money helped create Keytruda and has led to a private windfall for Merck. By that, I mean that the science behind immunotherapy emerged from decades of publicly funded academic research and government grants in the US, in Japan, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and an analysis performed for the project by the Swiss nonprofit called Public Eye estimated that Keytruda's research and development costs were just $1.9 billion, or 1% of the drug's global revenue since its launch in 2014. Adding failed clinical trials, the R&D estimate is about 4.8 billion, or 3%. Merck gave us a much, much higher number, which Public Eye found unverifiable. Public Eye concluded that the price of a vial of Keytruda was paid for long ago and has long ago been recouped. So what you have then is taxpayers funding much of the underlying science, patients now paying extremely high prices for the medicine, and Merck capturing much of the financial upside. And this is part of a global pattern for blockbuster medicines. And the third reason, and maybe the most important in terms of patients, is that it's Exhibit A for a broken global system, is the pricing of it. List prices range from about 80,000 for a year in treatment in Germany, 208,000 in the US, 93,000 in Lebanon, 130,000 in Colombia, 65,000 in South Africa, 116,000 in Croatia. And these disparities result in most countries in the world not being able to afford Keytruda at all.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney. We're gonna get a little bit more into that. I'm gonna turn to Bill now. Bill, the data that Serif shared with ICIJ over the course of reporting on this project showed that in the US, the cost of a typical Keytruda treatment can range from around $6,000 to about $44,000, just depending on where and how it's delivered. Can you speak a little bit to what's driving that variation?
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. Happy to be here. And a little about myself, I'm a health economist by training. And so I work for Serif Health. We're sourcing all of the commercial price transparency data that is newly available in the United States. And so this data was not available 5 years ago to even make this type of reporting. Um, the issue, and Sydney spoke very well to this, is that while there's a single molecule pembrolizumab, it's useful across a number of cancer indications. There are millions, if not billions, of distinct prices for Keytruda, and it depends who is buying it, who is selling it. Merck has certainly made a lot of money marketing Keytruda. The U.S. health system as a whole is also administering this drug at substantial markups, and so the data we are sourcing is posted by commercial payers like United Healthcare or Blue Cross Blue Shield or Aetna or Cigna. Those are going to be the contracted negotiated rates between the payer and a healthcare system like the Mayo Clinic or New York Presbyterian. This is where we're seeing the substantial variation in pricing, at least in the United States, where a single administration of Keytruda will be the same dosing, even across most indications. But you have this dramatic range where even within the same city, a treatment can be $6,000 at one site of care, $44,000 at the more expensive, typically like an academic medical center or a hospital. Lots of impacts, lots of factors are going to impact how this pricing is set. There's the payer's desire to keep the costs low or potentially high if they're kind of incentivized to push the treatment. Providers also have their own negotiating leverage. They're able to negotiate higher prices for services. And then programs, there are a number of federal programs like the 340B drug pricing program that incentivize providers to administer these drugs at markup while actually getting substantial discounts from manufacturers like Merck when they acquire the drug. Um, we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I think interesting that just there's no single price for Keytruda, and that's driving a lot of the variation we're seeing in the U.S.
Yeah, is that common? Is Keytruda an outlier, or is it, as sort of we've been mentioning, sort of emblematic of
Yeah, it's
a
completely emblematic of I would say healthcare pricing, particularly drug healthcare pricing in the United States.
Hmm.
Citi mentioned that $30 billion is kind of the annual Merck spending. The US health system is $5 trillion a year, and kind of drug pricing is going to be in the trillions. Um, every kind of administered oncology treatment, infusion therapy is all going to be um, priced in a similar way with substantial variation across markets, across providers. There are also going to be in the US system markups from the manufacturer to what's called a group purchasing organization who's acquiring the drug to the hospital. And how that impacts patients is that ultimately the patient is on the hook for 20% of whatever the final cost is typically. And that's going to have very substantial out-of-pocket costs for patients who need these life-saving treatments.
Wow. Okay, wow. Going back to Sydney really quick. Sydney, one thing you described in your reporting in your articles for this project is sort of patents, pricing, dosing are all factors when it comes to what what the cost is for patients and what they can access. Um, can you talk a little bit about each and what impact they have on access?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest direct barrier to patient access um, while patents are the biggest structural driver behind pricing, I would say that pricing is the biggest obstacle. And dosing and length of treatment affect company profits, but generally not really access. With dosing, just as an example, some leading cancer researchers told us that Merck promotes a higher dosage of Keytruda than necessary. One study found that the projected costs until 2040 for patients with the type of lung cancer would be $5 billion less if weight-based dosing was used in place of the fixed amount, which is 200 mgs every 3 weeks, regardless of a person's weight, and which is what's recommended by Merck. So a useful way to maybe look at it is high list prices affect insurance coverage decisions, government decisions, prior authorization hurdles, patients' out-of-pocket costs, and access in lower income countries. And just for some examples, in Brazil, for example, most cancer patients can't afford Keytruda, and thousands turn to the courts to get it. In South Africa, the vast majority of citizens aren't able to afford private health care, and the typical monthly income for a household is under $500, but a single dose of Keytruda costs roughly 10 times that much, or $4,900. There's a new study we found that raises concerns about Keytruda's affordability and access and sort of backs up what we're talking about. It shows that treatment for 6 months of Keytruda for head and neck cancer costs nearly 80 times the average monthly income in India and 43 times the average in Pakistan. The costs remain catastrophically high in wealthy countries too, where nearly 6 times the average monthly income in the US and 9 times the average in the UK. And in 6 months of Keytruda ranges from $7,600 in Bangladesh to $38,000 in Australia. So you can see the variety of pricing that Bill talked about in the United States is also true around the world and contributes to disparities.
Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on why that is, Sydney, internationally? Because I know, like, as you said, Bill spoke a little bit to the US specific healthcare system is set up in a way um, that drives up the cost. Internationally, what did you see from our partners reporting about what causes that disparity?
So I would say there's, primarily like a market structure and policy problem rather than like a simple supply and demand issue. A market problem because what we were talking about with patent exclusivity limiting competition, and oncology markets tolerate very high prices because therapies can be life extending. So buyers usually don't act like normal consumers because insurers and governments foot most of the bill. And it's a policy problem because of the patent law, because of the regulatory issues, because of the reimbursement rules, because of the negotiation policies. All these things strongly shape access. We spoke with a prominent researcher, an oncologist in Israel, who spoke about this policy problem and told us how really the whole thing starts in the United States. This is a fellow named Nathan Cherney who said that it really began in 2003 when the US Congress passed a non-interference clause as part of the Medicare law, requiring that the government not get involved in manufacturers' list prices. This is something totally set by companies without any sort of price negotiations. So the clause barred the federal government from negotiating any prices, and Cherney called this suspension of market forces um, uh, a suspension of market forces that ultimately made its way around the world and had impact around the world.
Yeah. Bill, do you want to add anything in terms of,
Yeah.
is it a policy issue or a market issue?
Yeah, I think definitely both echo Sydney that I think both kind of policy and the market has an impact here. And it does vary by country. I think my focus and expertise is definitely in US pricing, but if you think in Europe, these are our government bodies making decisions on behalf of entire populations through healthcare technology assessment and setting prices and then corresponding kind of patient cost sharing, allowing who's kind of eligible for the drug. In the United States, that's all going to be market driven. And it seems like neither is doing a particularly good job for patient access and patient spending. Um, in general, healthcare is not a well-functioning market. And so, as Sydney mentioned, patients are not thinking rationally about their healthcare, or if the choice is your money or your life, as to quote David Cutler, patients will choose their life, right? And like that is understandable. The problem is they're interacting with a number of economic actors, pharmaceutical manufacturers, healthcare providers, insurance companies, all of which do have a very real financial incentive to administer these drugs in a way that makes them money. Not saying that's their only kind of thing that they're optimizing on, that they also potentially care about patient care, but they do have fiduciary responsibilities and interests in gaining revenue, right? That's just, I think, in general, a challenge of healthcare that we have not done a very good job as a global society of figuring out. It's certainly not a clean supply and demand market. I think in the United States, as well as kind of other upper income countries, there's just a high level of regulation as well, that is going to make things like patents, patent extension, easier to do. That said, I think there is a value for incentivizing innovation. And so Merck did not trial and like prepare pembrolizumab. Um, I wouldn't say to help people, as maybe that's crass to say, or saying the obvious, but they made an investment into a treatment that they thought would have a financial windfall as a company. And so um, changing those types of organizational structures, be they like public benefit companies or things like that, is one way we can think about this in the future. The market in the United States, as designed today, is very much incentivized for um, profit maximization, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, on the topic sort of Merck and other pharmaceutical manufacturers and the financial incentives at play, the reason that Merck gives and gave us for the cost of the drug is that it reflects the drug's value, the cost of its development, and that the high prices fund future developments. What would a system that balances, innovation and access actually look like, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So I think we need to be honest on both sides of that question. And so Keytruda is a really important drug clinically. It has changed cancer care, and it's used broadly across the healthcare system in the United States, elsewhere. Um, we should reward companies to some degree that develop drugs like this, right? And you can think of other cases. An area that comes to mind for me is these new cell and gene therapies that can literally cure hemophilia or cure cancer with one administration. Um, those treatments are being priced at $1 million a treatment. And is that the value of saving a life? Maybe. But as a society, we haven't figured out how to bear the cost of that innovation and how to limit the rent seeking and profit maximization side, as some of like the worst actors have done. Um, it doesn't mean you need to allow every price or every kind of patent strategy that's being applied by these manufacturers. So I guess for me, how I would balance kind of the two sides of that coin. I mean, I work for Serif Healthcare, we're a transparency organization. Being transparent and being open about how these prices are set, what the manufacturer or the commercial payer thinks is the value of that treatment versus the cost, is something that I don't think we do a good enough job of explicitly thinking about in the United States. These are hard decisions, and do you kind of pay for more cancer care, or do you pay for more hemophilia care, for example? Or do you pay for everything and then have no money left over for Social Security? So thinking more about how we optimize like our budget and our taxpayer dollars is something that would be more helpful. Um, I guess the third point I would make is just around um, understanding where um, the competitive pressures exist and how we can encourage that more, be it through biosimilars or just changing patent law so that you can't extend a product into perpetuity like Merck is doing.
I would say, just to add that it's really important to sort of to consider that something our reporting showed, and that is that the access to Keytruda is not determined solely by medical need. Um, it's shaped by insurance design, it's shaped by national reimbursement policies, it's shaped by legal systems. So patients in wealthier countries or with comprehensive insurance are able to receive the drug earlier and more consistently, while many others face delays, restrictive eligibility criteria, high out-of-pocket costs, and need to resort to litigation just to obtain treatment. So in some systems, especially in Latin America, courts have become a pathway to access, and that favors patients with resources and legal support to challenge coverage or coverage denials. So our reporting highlights how the same medicine can be readily available in one health system and out of reach in another, producing significant inequalities that's often tied to income, geography, and institutional structure rather than clinical needs. So in developing solutions, it's important to take this into effect. A sharper way to kind of frame it is that our investigation shows that inequalities in access emerges at multiple levels, between countries, between public and private systems, and even between patients within the same healthcare system.
Yeah, in terms of policy and remedies to boost transparency, what kind of progress are we seeing? Can either of you speak to that both either in the US or internationally?
Yeah, I'm happy to feel that one. So I think we are seeing, I guess internationally, and Sydney, you can probably back me up here or have more information, but my understanding is that the drug pricing is typically set at the kind of the national or the local HTA, health technology assessment level. In the United States, I think we are making progress. And so there's been a bipartisan shift over the past, I guess, 5 or 6 years, beginning of the first Trump administration and continuing through recent rulemaking, recent executive orders. It is admittedly very kind of conservative economic friendly in that the push is that price transparency alone will lower prices. Um, that said, I think the data available today, there are organizations like myself who exist to collect, compile, enrich, and make this data usable, only because the regulations are not sufficient for a typical consumer to do so. We are sourcing this data using supercomputers, using cloud analytics, using very high kind of Amazon kind of cloud storage costs. The typical patient is not going to be able to effectively price shop for a treatment. I think that is changing, and there are some patients or some patient advocacy organizations who are pushing for example, paying cash for a medication treatment. That can be substantially a lower cost if you just pay the provider directly for a treatment rather than going through the insurance contracted rate. Um, that being said, it's a slim minority of patients who are able to make um, informed decisions in a kind of typical consumer basis when faced with a life-threatening condition. And I don't necessarily think we should ask patients to do that. We should design systems either at the state level or the national level, even kind of globally, that promote access and kind of make pricing more equitable.
So Bill mentioned the health technology assessments that are used in some countries. And these are really quite amazing, actually. What their experts will go through a look at a treatment for Keytruda, for example, and discover how much it's worth, and use some very sophisticated analytics and survival statistics to sort of get the answer to that question. But as a result of these health technology assessments, what Germany says, for example, might not be the same as what the UK says. So a patient in one country might have Keytruda available for um, triple negative breast cancer, for example, or some types of triple negative breast cancer, while in another country, it might not be available. It might be deemed too expensive. So that's sort of another thing, another way these inequalities arise. And I don't think there's globally any sort of, consideration. Well, there is consideration being given to like harmonizing the systems, but um, uh, I don't think countries sort of agree with whose system should be on top.
Was there something you wanted to add to that, Bill?
I agree with you, Sydney. I think that there's widespread disagreement across countries, and it comes down to what we value, right? And that's a very hard question when it comes to um, patient lives and extending life. Oftentimes, I guess one anecdote I'll note, the Affordable Care Act explicitly bans these types of analyses. So cost-effective analysis is banned by federal decision makers, explicitly because Congress does not want us valuing life explicitly in the United States. And so we do comparative effectiveness analysis. Pembrolizumab is by far the best clinical treatment, pricing excluded, for these cancers. And that's why it's used by doctors, and that's why patients want it. Um, there is no there's no explicit consideration of value versus a generic chemotherapy. And so extending life 3 months, 6 months, 1 year for patients. The United States has typically said that that is valuable and then we will pay for it without any consideration of costs or opportunity costs for those dollars. So those are very hard judgments to make. US organizations, federal government is much less willing than European kind of price regulators, HTAs, to make those judgments.
Yeah, so uh, one treatment, a treatment can extend a life for just say a month, right, in the United States, and it will be paid for. Um, that's why we're considered, the United States is sort of considered the gold standard. You can sort of get whatever you want, but that's not true in Europe. They might not pay for a treatment that only provides a month of survival.
So, am I understanding you correctly, Bill? Is that sort of the inability to do that sort of economic, more granular, maybe value analysis, is that hamstringing sort of efforts to make those like value choices and potentially bring the cost down? Or
I would argue it's done implicitly. And so if there's not formal decision making by a kind of a voter appointed organization, and then like thinking about kind of the public will to make these types of value determinations, in the United States, that's going to be set by a market. And that market is going to be composed of manufacturers, it's going to be composed of health systems, insurance companies. Who I think has the least voice in that process is the individual consumer and the individual patient. And so I would say that the US system of price setting is um, not ideal in these cases. Sydney alluded to um, other issues though in Europe, right? Where, or in Canada or other kind of countries around the world who use these HTA processes where um, the government has decided that you are not eligible for treatment and therefore you are not allowed to receive it. And so that gets on kind of the libertarian perspective. We all have our own kind of values about where that plays out. But it's very, very different in the US compared to Europe for sure.
Yeah, but I do think also that the drug companies need to do a better job of like figuring out how long a treatment should go on. For
Mhm.
example, I mean, in Canada, for example, you can't get Keytruda for more than, I think it's 2 years. Or, but there are many oncologists who think that after 6 months, it's not worth very much anymore. And I don't think the drug companies have put a sort of a um, have discovered what, or I'm sorry, the regulators as well have put a limit on it. I think that should. Um, I don't think the clinical trials are have been sort of very um, proof oriented in that way.
When you say proof oriented, what do you mean by that, Sydney?
I'm sorry. I mean, they haven't really uncovered what the best length of time is for a specific
Mm.
duration of treatment, just like the dosing, right? What is the best dosing? Um, are the critics who say people do just as well with much less Keytruda, are they right? There aren't good clinical study designs for this kind of stuff, and
Mhm.
there should be.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Sydney. And I would say that there is no incentive for manufacturers to run clinical trials that reduce costs. And there are no organizations that take up that mantle of saying, let's do a dosing study. These require, again, it gets back to R&D, and I think R&D costs can be overinflated for sure. But there are real costs here, and I don't think you can expect, I mean, I think a lot of folks on this call would hope that for-profit organizations would be ethical actors. I think fiduciary responsibility in like a publicly traded company is the exact opposite of that. They have a very clear goal in mind that they are legally bound to push forward with. We need new organizations and new, I guess, regulations or laws that encourage biosimilar entry or competitive approaches in healthcare, particularly drugs.
There are some countries that are increasingly looking at things like dosing and duration. One of the leaders is India, which is trying everything it can to sort of expand access. So many people could benefit from Keytruda who aren't getting it there. And so the studies have, while there's nothing definitive about the studies yet, they tend to suggest that smaller doses of Keytruda work. Um, but these are studies that are largely done without the input from the manufacturer. And the manufacturer says that, I mean, the FDA approvals are for a certain amount of Keytruda every 3 weeks or every 6 weeks. And so, basically, manufacturers like Merck fall on the FDA and say that's the reason they're the gold standard, and these are the doses that the FDA has approved.
So, a follow-up question when it comes to dosing, is that something that we've seen with other pharmaceutical products?
Yes, it is. It is, although I'm not sure. I mean, the amounts of savings are quite amazing with Keytruda just because it's such an expensive drug. Uh, uh, a, a WHO study suggests that, as I mentioned before, that $5 billion could be saved with lower doses of just from people who have non-small cell lung cancer. And if you add in all the other kinds of cancer, it might be a savings of $10 billion through the year 2040. But yes, there are some other, we have seen this with other drugs. I don't know if it's to the same extent as Keytruda.
Got you. Okay, I wanted to remind our audience really quick that you can submit questions, so please do. I have one last question I'm going to ask Sydney, and then we're going to get into our Q&A. Sydney, one thing as we've talked about, there's This project has involved a lot of reporting internationally, working with a lot of international partners, and obviously health, cancer, these pharmaceutical companies, they're global and universal, but the idiosyncrasies of each country's healthcare system and legal system, and economic situation are very, very different. What were the challenges, of reporting this project out and of managing that collaboration? What stories came out of it that maybe you didn't anticipate?
Yeah, so working with 47 media partners was both, incredibly challenging and also incredibly powerful. As you mentioned, Carmen, the complexity comes from coordinating reporters across different languages, different legal systems, different skill sets, different newsroom cultures, different time zones, and maintaining the shared standards for verification. So different countries also have very different rules around medical transparency, court records, pharmaceutical regulation. So our partners for this project filed more than 1,000 public records requests with varying results. But it's really collaboration that made the project possible. I don't think there's ever been a project about the global implications of a blockbuster drug. No single newsroom could have captured how access to Keytruda and prices for Keytruda vary so wildly globally. Um, Local reporters understand the realities of their health systems, whether that means navigating public insurance data or speaking with patients who have gone to court for treatment, examining how reimbursement decisions are made nationally. It's really the collaboration that allowed us to show that inequalities are systemic rather than isolated incidents. So here was a project with 124 journalists across 36 countries. And that structure is really central to ICIJ's model because many powerful pharma systems, from patent strategies, pricing secrecy, lobbying, tax structures, regulatory loopholes, unequal access to medicine, all of these systems operate globally. So, and another thing ICIJ is known for, and that this project used to our advantage, is handling these massive data sets, just as in the Panama Papers, which many of you probably know us for. So, like I mentioned, Cancer Calculus used more than 1,000 public records requests in 27 countries. Our data people use patent databases, we use pricing databases, we use court filings, payment disclosures, corporate records, patient crowdfunding, and our data people were able to aggregate all of this info across different countries. And perhaps most importantly, our model allowed us to connect these systems to human consequences. So in cancer calculus, we found deeply human stories. We found people dying while waiting for insurance approvals. We found patients who died from counterfeit Keytruda. We found doctors rationing care. We found patients who survived longer but might have died without Keytruda. And it's why I always sort of explain to people that the best global reporting is really local. The blend of systemic investigation and personal impact is really a hallmark of what ICIJ does.
Are there any specific stories that stuck with you, Sydney, either the people that you interviewed or from our reporting partners?
Yeah, several. There's the man in Mexico who uh, was in a public hospital and got counterfeit Keytruda twice. There's a woman in Spain who was patient zero and survived because of Keytruda. She was one of the first people to get it. Um, there was a doctor in Guatemala who had to choose, who only had um, uh, two patients he could choose to get Keytruda. And so he had to make this terrible judgment about who to give it to, right? So all of these are like real people and real inequalities that kind of exist.
Carmen, I can add a little bit there too.
Please,
Speaking
yeah.
speaking with Austin Fast, who was one of the journalists on the ICIJ team at USA Today. Great kind of US focused study, if or focused article, if folks are interested in looking it up. He found some patients in the California market. And so these were patients at UC Davis. We were able to validate their out-of-pocket estimate, like their out-of-pocket spending in our own data. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket spending for Keytruda. Looking at the disparity even within the same market, there are kind of local outpatient federally qualified health centers, which much lower pricing for Keytruda in the same market. So if patients had the ability to choose, could have drastically lowered their spending. Again, for the same clinical treatment, for really the same kind of health benefits. And so there are opportunities to reduce like the substantial burden that Merck and kind of the broader health system are placing on patients here. Um, those steps have not been taken by patient advocacy organizations or others who could take positive steps here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna segue into some questions from our audience. We got a lot of very thoughtful questions from our attendees, including cancer patients and their families. So it's clear this is resonating with a lot of folks. Um, I'd like you both to take a stab at this one because it really gets to the heart of like the affordability debate, from a patient perspective. Cancer trial participants volunteer their time and take real risks to help develop this drug. Public funding also played a role. So, how should the public think about ownership and access in a case like this? And at what point should people expect something back in terms of affordability or access?
Uh, yeah, we talked about that a little bit. And there were some critics who say that really patients pay twice, right? They pay once uh, because they, in large measure, um, pay for the research and development. Although there's a debate, Merck says it pays tens of billions of dollars for research and development. There is a debate about that. But the question is, should then the price go down? Should taxpayers pay less because they've already paid for some of the research and development? Um, I mean, I think that's a very good question. I'm not in a position to to say yes or no, but I can understand patients getting, um, wondering about that and about if they're involved in clinical trials or research and development is paid for by the public, whether they should get something back.
Yeah, I think it's clear to all of us that the status quo is not ideal, and there are clear impacts on patients from the way things are set up today, particularly in the United States. Um, I will say there are new models, again, this kind of aspect of a public benefit corporation where the organization is designed for public benefit and then is able to reap tax incentives from that. That's essentially like a nonprofit status. Um, that being said, I think um, should clinical trial patients kind of have a stake in Merck's product? Probably not. They are receiving kind of free treatment as part of the trial to like a new advanced treatment. I don't see kind of our patent law system being that kind of overhauled, particularly given kind of the courts and things like that. I will say that governments can take steps with limited with some impact. And so I think I'll point to two items. One has been less successful. Another is definitely still in progress. And so one thing that Gavin Newsom announced, I think 3 or 4 years ago, was that California was going to make a generic insulin. Um, California has not done that, given regulatory hurdles or lawsuits or for a variety of different reasons. It has proven difficult for a state organization, a state actor, to develop a low-cost insulin compared to for-profit manufacturers who are making this treatment for markups and for profit. On the other hand, I think an interesting policy that the Trump administration is really forcing on manufacturers. I think a lot of I guess traditionally more conservative individuals would maybe take issue with this, but enforcing price limits on these types of organizations. And so through its most favored nation, MFN policy, the Trump administration is pushing for the United States to have the lowest pricing for new treatments compared to the rest of the world, or at least to Europe and kind of other higher income countries. Will that lower price in the United States, or will it raise prices elsewhere? I think that question is still kind of to be decided. But there are actions typically that government actors can take to impact these types of impacts on patients.
I think we've, Bill, already discovered that the price of Keytruda has actually risen since the Trump announcements,
Mhm.
and the price overseas in some countries, UK is one, has also risen. And
Yeah,
we are aware of advocates for poorer nations that say that it's going to make things that the most favored nation will make things even worse in poor
yeah,
countries. So
I've heard those points. Mhm.
sort of,
Yeah, so I think we should try a lot of different policies and see how it works. It doesn't seem like we've been successful to date. So I think I'll point to transparency as being, particularly in the United States, one area I always call it necessary but not sufficient for change. I think you need to first understand how these things are priced. And so 10 years ago, none of this reporting that Sydney and her team did would be possible around the pricing aspects. Um, Understanding where the disparities and inequities exist, shining light on them, like ICIJ has done here, and then having those policy discussions, be it kind of voter to politician or kind of patient advocacy organization to policymaker, um, better understanding and ringing the bell that this is not fair, not equitable, to those kind of um, least qualified, at least capable to have an impact on the end result, and are most impacted by it in terms of patients being hurt. So
Thank you guys. This next one I think is for Sydney. We've gotten a couple questions regarding the reporting from a project on counterfeit Keytruda products, which I think you mentioned one patient in Mexico that received counterfeit Keytruda. Um, the question is, what did our reporting show about patients turning to these unsafe alternatives when legitimate treatments are for like Keytruda are out of reach?
yeah. So counterfeit versions of Keytruda are, I I think we discovered, closely tied to the drug's very high price. And that's because high prices create both desperation among patients and huge profit incentives for criminal networks. We found that the counterfeit trade is booming and perhaps growing, uh, particularly in Latin America and South Asia, and also to maybe a smaller degree in sub-Saharan Africa. And as I mentioned before, our partners at Univision discovered this patient at a public hospital who received counterfeit Keytruda not once, but twice. And I think Mexican health authorities identified at least 11,000 counterfeit units across 10 public institutions. So this is a growing problem, and it involves uh, um, manufacturers probably need to pay more attention to supply chains. Um, drug enforcement agents need to figure out how they can nail counterfeit products. There were some interesting scams uncovered by our Indian partners about vials being actually refilled in in hospitals in India with counterfeit Keytruda or falsified Keytruda. Um, so yeah, this is, I think, going to be a growing problem for blockbuster drugs. And again, not only Keytruda, but other expensive medications.
Sydney, I have my own follow-up question. What are you learning about the quality of those treatments? Are they as efficacious as a kind of Merck product? Is it the same? Is it actually pembrolizumab as a molecule, or is it something else that
The
will not be
counterfeits,
effective?
the
Yeah.
counterfeits,
Hmm.
yeah, they're sometimes completely false, um, uh, and they're sometimes watered down, I think. So they're not as efficacious as Pembro.
Yeah. I think it speaks to the that desperation point you made where if given no other option, patients are willing to turn to something that might not even be effective for their treatment. So definitely need better options. And I think moves by manufacturers, and again, my focus is certainly on the United States, but moves by manufacturers to broaden access in low and middle income countries. We've seen this a lot with HIV treatments, right? Where um, make your money in the upper income countries while providing clinical value at cost to lower and middle income countries, I think is a very strong strategy. And I think there was a big push by the US government, by Europe, to promote that type of modeling. Maybe the headwinds are going the other way today, where it seems like that's less the case. So it's very complex for sure.
Yeah, well, as we're winding down, I wanted to ask both of you any last thoughts, lasting, impressions that you want our audience to take away. Maybe Sydney, go ahead first.
Um, Let me think. Well, I'm eager to continue with the reporting. Bill just touched on this a little bit. Like, I'm eager to sort of figure out the role of middlemen in influencing high prices. Um, I'd also like to look at the enforcement practices in the US to see how prosecutors examine anti-competitive conduct, not only with Keytruda, but other pharmaceutical projects. And, I'm curious about local governments. Increasingly, um, uh, uh, pharmaceutical companies are building their plants in the United States, and they're winning more incentives um, to open up these plants. So I'm curious about, the public money that might be influencing the price of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I think I would just circle back to the earlier point about while the reporting by ICIJ highlights a lot of issues specific to Keytruda in terms of the patent greening and some of their behaviors in low and middle income countries that are certainly not desirable. I think these types of pricing disparities and just general inequities are endemic across drug pricing and across healthcare in general. We have not, as a society, figured out, and both on the European side as well as they're kind of the kind of health technology assessment side as well as the U.S. pricing side, how to fairly provide these drugs to the most people and do the most good with them. I'm particularly worried as we enter into the age of cell and gene therapies. And so I recommend everyone on the call to just take a look at what's in the pipeline in terms of cell and gene therapy. I think there's over 1,000 treatments being developed by a number of top manufacturers. They are promising to cure diseases like hemophilia, sickle cell disease, cancers of all kinds, and with one shot. I'll just say that the big kind of factor here is that they're going to price them $1 million treatments, and that's going to have a huge impact on both national and then patient spending. So,
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both. I think we're just about out of time. But thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you to our audience for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for engaging with our work, and I hope you stick around for other events like these. As I mentioned at the top, ICIJ is a nonprofit, a donor-funded organization, which means we really, really do rely on everyone's support and engagement. That's what allows us to do this kind of work, and bring you this kind of information. So if you would like to learn more, you can find us at icij.org, where you can read Cancer Calculus, and find more information there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
thank you.